My name is Jennifer Ruskin. I am here on behalf of WIL Australia, representing the events subcommittee of our professional learning committee. And I'm here at Macquarie University, and I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we are all meeting today. In my case, I'm at Macquarie University on the Wallumattagal lands of the Darug Nation, and I'd like to pay our respects to elders past and present. Wollongamaroo is a Darug language name meaning follow your path. And I think that's a fitting place to start this conversation around, for us and for our students, figuring out how to navigate using generative AI in the WIL space. So just a few bits of housekeeping. So I'll be chairing the panel discussion. We have our wonderful speakers, our panelists from CRADLE and from the AI group at CRADLE. And I will introduce them in just a moment. We will then we'll have our panel discussion. During that time, if you have any questions, please do post them to the chat. We have a few questions planned, and then we'll go to we'll draw from the chat for your questions at the end. And we will also be taking a few snapshots for LinkedIn. So if you are uncomfortable having your photo or your image on LinkedIn, please, you can vote by just turning off your camera if you prefer. And I think that is all of our housekeeping. So I will now move on to introducing our presenters. I'm very pleased to introduce that we have Associate Professor Bonnie Dean from the University of Wollongong. She is a longtime leader at WIL Australia. And we have Associate Professor Joanna Tai from CRADLE, which is the Center for Research and Assessment and Digital Learning at Deakin. And we have Dr. Jack Walton, who is also from CRADLE at Deakin. And we have Associate Professor Kelly Nicola Richmond, who is also from Deakin University. And I'm a little sad to say we would have had Dave Cormier from Thompson Rivers University in Canada, but unfortunately, he had a flight delay and is unable to join us. But I'm thrilled to kick off our event now, and I also forgot to mention two things. One is I can see that you are posting the lands from which you're joining today. Please do feel free to post. And the second is that we had 499 people registered for today's event, which is a record for WIL Australia and is just one registrant shy of our cap. So we're thrilled to be able to accommodate everybody who was interested and in such large numbers. So with that, I will turn the first question, I will turn to Bonnie and ask if you can tell us a little bit about why we're here today.
Thank you, Jen. Hello, everybody. It is just delightful to see all of your beautiful faces. Thank you to those who have your cameras on, and to those who don't, hello, that's totally fine. Please have your tea and toast while you enjoy this seminar today. We are here for one particular reason, and that is to officially launch a set of resources that have been designed for WIL stakeholders regarding the use of generative AI. We thought we would do this in an online event format so that you can hear from some of us in terms of, the reason behind we developed these resources, how we collaborated to develop the resources, and ways in which they might be used. We also thought it would be a great way to connect with each other. So please feel free to use the chat. We really would love to get some feedback as well on how you think the resources could be used, or if you have used the resources. And it's really exciting to see everybody here and ensure that we are having an open conversation around ways in which we can transparently and ethically integrate GenAI into our conversations and existing processes in the work integrated learning space. Look, what we know across the higher education sector is that there is quite a lot of focus on AI, especially around student learning and assessment. Look, one area that is particularly unique and complex perhaps even challenging, is the area of work integrated learning. For those of us who are in this space, we know this because not only are students governed by the policies at university, they also have their own preferences and practices that they use Gen AI in a variety of different ways, and they have preferences in terms of the tools that they like to use and the ways in which they like to use it. Now, what we do in WIL is we take those students and we embed them in a brand new space, a socio-technical space, but also a space that has different policies to perhaps those that they have been used to. And what we have within work integrated learning is some excellent processes already established to support our students into work integrated learning. What we thought was missing was conversations and attention specifically to how Gen AI can be used and approached inside those new workspaces. Now, this could be a placement. It could be something where the student is physically located inside an organization, or it could be remote. It could be something that they're doing online, or it could even be an industry project. It doesn't really matter what type of work integrated learning mode we're talking about. What we actually do need to prioritize is that a focus on Gen AI is at the beginning of their WIL experience, that they're supported throughout and get feedback on the ways in which it is used or not used during the WIL experience. And afterwards, there's some sort of reflections and learnings, especially from the educator and the industry partner, so that we can ensure that we take that learning back and integrate it into our own practices as WIL practitioners and educators. So what we have are 3 resources, or a set of resources, depending which one you download on the guide. So there's one that is basically a compilation. And then we've also separated them for you into resources for industry, resources for university staff, and resources for students. These are completely open access, and it is our pleasure to share them with you. Use them, edit them, pick and choose what is useful for you in your context. What is important is that we've highlighted a range of discrete areas across different stages of WIL so that you can focus on the areas that make sense in your context. Earlier in our conversations, we realized that we weren't going to be able to provide a cut and dry set of rules or guides because contexts are different and learners are different, priorities and preferences in even just tools are different, as well as disciplines. So what you have there as a set of reflective questions, and they're reflective to facilitate conversation. Before I close off and hand over to my beautiful co-authors here, part of the team, I just want to offer some thank yous. Thanks, WIL Australia, for hosting us. We really appreciate that you jumped in and said that you'd be willing to host this seminar for us. And also thank you for CRADLE, who's co-hosting this today as well. Thank you to CRADLE, who have been magnificent in supporting us. We've got Joe and Jack and also Kelly from Deakin, who's also affiliated with CRADLE. And we've also got our international partner, Dave. So thanks, CRADLE, so much for supporting these resources. But I also just want to make a special mention to those who actually collaborated and provided feedback. These were industry partners, so those who do take our WIL students. These are educators, as well as WIL managers and coordinators, as well as students. And this is across Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and Dubai. So thank you so much. You can see a list of those contributors on the main document on the final page. That's it from me, Jen. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Bonnie. So it is so good to hear about sort of a little bit more background about why the resources were developed. And as a person who's engaged with them in a very limited way, it's great to hear what your thinking was about the potential for how we can continue to use them. And I suppose on that note, and to hear a little bit more about that, I'd like to turn at this point to Joe and ask you if you can share the story behind the development of the resources.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. The short version of the story is that we met a lot. We had so many meetings from sort of October when we first had the symposium all the way through till sort of early March when we were rapidly trying to get them all nice and pretty for release. But I guess the backstory behind that, how we got to be a group of people working together, is that CRADLE every year hosts sort of an international research symposium, which sounds very fancy. But it's basically we get together, we figure out a topic, and we invite people who are doing really cool, important research in that area to CRADLE to have a chat and to work through some of the current problems that exist. And these are problems that exist in the world. You know, we do research, but the research has to connect to things that are actually important for people just beyond our little group. So last year's symposium in 2024 was about GenAI and work integrated learning. And when we got in the room together, we realized, gee, there's not that much out there. Where do we start? What do we do? And while some people had great ideas for sort of conceptual work and different papers that they could write, I think Bonnie piped up pretty early. Well, actually, everyone on the ground really just needs to know exactly what's going on, like what guidance is there. And we're like, oh, surely there's something out there. And then we realized actually we had to create this guidance ourselves. You know, after the sort of 2.5 days of working together, you know, there was the point where everyone goes, so what do you actually want to work on? What are the collaborations that are actually going to come out of this meeting? And a few of us put our hands up and went, yeah, we want to do the practical thing. We want the thing that actually will make a difference, hopefully. Well, you know, we wanted to make a difference. And so that's how this small group was formed. And I guess we really saw it from the point of, well, actually, there's a lot of variation out there in what people know. Just from our own experiences, we've you know, talked to students who are like so pro at using whatever Gen AI tools were already in existence, you know, back 6 months ago, which has now changed completely. And then there were educators, some of them who knew so much as well, and were, you know, was really leaning into the affordances in their day-to-day practice. And then we knew that there were other people who were still, you know, couldn't tell you the difference between ChatGPT and Google. So that was kind of the spot we landed in. And when we went, well, what kind of resource would work? You know, what kind of guidance does everyone need? We realized, as Bonnie said, we couldn't just offer, you know, here are the 3 things you need to do. Here's the 10 top tips for how to use GenAI, because WIL takes in such a broad variety of different contexts, different disciplines, different professions, you know, different goals for students. And that's, we increasingly, you know, we started writing down questions. We're like, well, maybe questions would be a better way to go about it, because ultimately it's that shared understanding that we need to develop between people working together, learning together. And we started off, we'll just do a guide for educators. And then we realized, oh, students will also need some of this information. And then we went, hang on a minute. There's also people at the university. And it just, you know, it went from 1 thing to 3 things, plus some extra examples. And that's what we've ended up with across, multiple meetings. And because Dave has been in Canada the whole time. They've always been sort of 9 a.m. Wednesday meetings, sometimes Tuesday, sometimes Thursday, but to bridge that time difference. And so there's been a lot of thought, a lot of reflection. We've also spent time, we shared it with a few friends and colleagues to get initial feedback by a few. I think in the acknowledgements list, there's about 20 people on that list, including students who are currently doing placements and students who'd previously been on placements or done WIL in other settings. So we got a lot of feedback from everyone, refined the guides, and that's how we've ended up with this amazing set of resources. And thanks, Bonnie, for being our motivator and leader and the person who has kept on pushing with this when perhaps some of us were going, oh, wow, what else is there still to do? There's so much still to do. So thanks, Bonnie, and I'll hand back to Jennifer.
Excellent. Thank you, Joe. And thank you to the whole team for being the ones who put up your hands at that time to follow up and share and do all the work that has led us to where we are right now. So Jack, at this point, I'd like to turn to you and ask, why are we focusing on Gen AI? How has higher education, how has the sector responded to Gen AI?
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. I feel like that's, in some ways the $1 million question we just keep asking ourselves every time we have a conversation about AI, higher education and learning. it's obviously it's a really big question. There are a few bits to that I think are really important. And I was thinking as I was listening to the others talking a little earlier, the two key words for me around this are ubiquity and uncertainty. I think, I feel like I often start talks and papers now with a statement kind of like, AI is ubiquitous to higher education. It's not exactly a new idea anymore. But I think sitting underneath that, there is a really important issue, which is come through what Bonnie and Joe have both uh, talked about already, which is that the way that AI plays out in educational practice is extremely diverse. We know this from the research that is just starting to come out around the ways that students and academics perceive and work with artificial intelligence tools of all sorts. So underneath the ubiquity is an extraordinary diversity, and it's still really, really early days, I think, in terms of what we think the technology might be doing to learning, and particularly, I've got to say, learning through work. There's that interesting confluence of context and stakeholders that is just so particular to work-based learning that makes it really for a melting pot of possibilities. The technology is changing really fast, and alongside that, I think our relationships to it are changing in tandem with it. So it's kind of a moving feast, which is maybe the unsatisfying answer. I do think it's that combination of really widespread adoption, the rapid evolution, and developing understandings that is what is creating for that kind of complex environment we're always talking about around AI and higher education. And that is really difficult when it comes to managing a response. I think appreciating the difficulty and the uncertainty that comes with that management aspect, that's something really for us to keep an eye on. And I think that actually played out in the way that these resources came together. And just thinking about what it would be to actually put these guidelines into use was really a constant thread through the conversations that we had. It's such a tricky balancing act. We have regulatory obligations as higher ed providers to work towards something that looks like a sensible response to AI across learning contexts. And it's so easy to think that we just need to find the right solution and then we're going to move on. And, spoilers, probably not that simple. I think it's the scope and the continuity of change that just means that's not going to be a short-term reality. Where I think we've run into trouble in the past is really trying to adopt dogmatic approaches, particularly when we try to dictate what students can and can't do with a kind of vice-like grip. So I think the shift we're starting to see now is a bit of realization that we need to find ways to really account for flexibility and change, and taking that as a bit of a design principle. And that's what we've really tried to do with our materials. So partnership, I will say, I think is really invaluable in that respect, and something that we've really tried to achieve with these materials, which really do require a bit of interpretation and partnership in how they're taken up.
Excellent. Thank you, Jack. And when you say partnership and sort of ongoing flexibility and adaptability and being ready for change, it sounds like the perfect conversation to fit into just about any WIL conversation or any conversation about the WIL space. So thank you for that. And Kelly, I'd like to ask you, what are the challenges that you're seeing that students, university staff, and partners are facing with GenAI, particularly in the WIL space?
Thanks, Jennifer. Yeah, really interesting question to be given to answer, because I suspect just about everyone in the room would have insight and perspectives on some of the challenges that we're experiencing in the WIL space when it comes to GenAI. And hopefully we'll be able to have some discussion in our Q&A time around that to get people's perspectives. I guess for context, my thoughts are based on previous experience as a health professional, so a physiotherapist who supervised students for many years, and more recently involvement in the university side of placement, so coordinating placements in an occupational therapy program, I also, in my role as Associate Head of School Teaching and Learning, sit on 8 or so advisory boards for our different course offerings. And so hearing a lot from industry representatives on those advisory boards. And some of what I'll talk about today is also based on some recent research that we've done talking about occupational therapists working clinically in practice around GenAI use by students. And I guess when it comes to the challenges, I think some of the biggest challenges experienced by all three of those groups, so students, academics or educators, and also industry professionals involved in WIL, is that many of them feel underprepared, or they feel like they haven't got enough knowledge when it comes to Gen AI and what it can and can't do. And how they can use it. That isn't always the case. We know that we've got some students who are very proficient in its use. We've interviewed recently some OT clinicians who are using it very actively in their workplace and in their practice. But across the board, probably in all of the work I do, I've seen that more people feel underprepared. And alongside that, as Jack mentioned, really feel that it's hard to keep up. The space is so rapidly changing and shifting. There's this feeling that I just can't keep up. And many of our academics in the research we've undertaken have told us that. There's confusion about privacy and security. And what is and isn't okay. There's a general belief we've found in the work that I've led from many students and some industry professionals that if I just don't put the client's name in or anyone's personal details in, or if I don't put any student work in, it's all okay. But it doesn't really, that sort of depth of knowledge around privacy and security beyond that seems to be a challenge. Also some concern around the ethics and what is and isn't okay when it comes to Gen AI use. And that's tricky because that can be different in different WIL environments and in different places. Interestingly, in the work that we've done, the ethical element hasn't been as strong as I might have expected. The ethics even of how the Gen AI tools collate data and or even the potential gender bias that it might display, that doesn't come up as much as I thought it might have. When it comes specifically to WIL, there's different rules. So if I talk about health in Victoria, as an example, in our public health services, generally there's a rule that you don't use Gen AI tools, that staff shouldn't be using them. We send a lot of students, however, to private practices, so small-scale private health agencies or private businesses, and often in those environments it's been embraced. Not necessarily with policy and procedure that students can draw on to know what is and isn't okay, but there is use of Gen AI in a whole range of ways, from doing your case notes, but, adding the names later, writing reports or requests for fundings, to Gen AI tools actually live recording your consultation with a client or a person while you're doing it. So lots of different uses. Deakin as a university has invested a lot in providing resources for staff and students, but there's still fairly widespread reported confusion about what is and isn't okay and when. There's a recent large-scale Australian study that involves more than 8,000 students that you might be aware of. 83% of students are reporting using Gen AI and 40% reported using it when they're not supposed to. So this isn't something that's on the fringe anymore. There's very widespread use. When I think about the young people in my life, and I'm of an age where I'm surrounded by 18 to 22-year-olds, whether they're my own children, nieces and nephews, etc., and our research bears this out as well, many young people think this is just another tool for me to use. They don't necessarily, in the first instance, think more deeply about when, privacy, security, confidentiality, inappropriate use of other people's knowledge, all of those things. So I think that's a challenge as well, is how we, adapt and prepare our students for workplaces where Gen AI will be part of their work, but also acknowledge that there are times when its use isn't appropriate. When I talk briefly about what the occupational therapists in industry were telling us, they had real concerns around the impact Gen AI might have on their students who come for placements, critical thinking, their ability to be person-centered in their practice, so to put that client that they're working with at the center of what they're doing and make sure that their priorities are number one, and also their ability to clinically reason or to justify what they do in their day-to-day work. And I guess to finish off, what we're grappling with in the university space at Deakin and in the school that I'm involved in is that real need to prepare students for a workplace where Gen AI is a part of day-to-day work, but also to give them the underpinning ethics, knowledge about when it isn't appropriate to use it, and also the ability to adapt to whatever workplace they're in. And then from the university perspective, alongside that, we need to make sure that we can still assure that students are getting the competencies and the skills and knowledge that we say they graduate with despite Gen AI. So I think that's all from me, Jennifer. Hopefully that was useful.
Excellent. That was really great, Kelly. Thank you. It's good to hear about sort of how things can be different within a discipline, in different organizations, across disciplines, and to really think about just how we need to be nuanced as we plan for those different environments and interactions. So before I jump into a few questions that I'll throw to the whole panel, I'd like to remind people, I know quite a few people have joined since we started talking. So two things. One is that we'll take a few LinkedIn photos or screenshots for LinkedIn. So please do keep your camera on if you're open to being in a LinkedIn photo. And for those who joined later, if you're not open to that, please do just turn off your camera. And I also wanted to encourage anybody we've had some lovely comments and conversation within the chat. If anybody has questions for the panel, please post them to the chat so that we can come to them after we've had a chance to address a few more questions. So the first question for the panel is around feedback that you've received so far on the resources. And before I hand that question to the panel, I'll just comment that I'm one of the WIL unit convener who has dabbled a little bit with the resources. They were launched just at the time that my students were engaging in a simulation of an internship in the classroom, and only one part of the students, about a quarter of the students, had a digital focus to their project that they were doing. And so those resources were a really great way for me to encourage all of the students to think about how they could have used or did use or what it might look like. And so it was very much just getting them to integrate a few of the questions that I got from the resources into their reflection. So I've had a limited but very positive experience so far with the resources. And with that, I'd like to hand over to anybody on the panel who'd like to speak to that.
Thanks, Jen. I'll speak to that one. Thanks so much for giving it a try. It's exciting to hear your willingness to experiment with the resources. It doesn't have to be fully thought out at this stage. What's important is that you open them up and assess what is it that our students need at this point in time, and is there some guidance that I can draw upon for inspiration inside the resources. So thanks for just giving it a whirl. Love that. Look, they've only been online really for about a month now, and we kind of did it quite secretly. This was really the big loud announcement that they are ready and available. So our feedback at this stage is really quite anecdotal. I was in New Zealand 2 weeks ago for the Working Together Learning NZ conference, and I can see some fellow colleagues who were over there. Hey guys, hello online. And look, it was, I shared this as part of a presentation and had some really great interest afterwards of those indicating that this was something that they needed, and this was something that they were ready to circulate to colleagues and friends. What I encouraged there, and what I would encourage here, is that we just set a meeting with our WIL team, and it's a meeting, or it's an agenda item on your meeting to have a discussion about how they could be used, and if you're ready or at a stage where you can use them. One small example from my institution: look, when you're in the WIL space, we have a range of influence and control, obviously, over our own units or subjects and students that we take care of. We can have larger control, but I feel really empowered at the moment because we're going through a review of our work integrated learning policy. And as a result of having these resources released, we now have an item that has been drafted for inclusion in our work integrated learning policy. And I feel like that's a bit of a win, because I know that it's quite tricky to change policy easily. So I feel like that's something I'm really excited about. And then at our next work integrated learning advisory meeting, which is next month, we actually do have this as an agenda item where we can actually go around and talk about the ways we can collaborate with each other and share ideas for how we could possibly use them.
Wonderful, thank you. Kelly, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I'll jump in there too, and just say that although it's early days, as Bonnie said, I think there's been I've been met with lots of enthusiasm. So we have a number of websites for industry partners who supervise students, and the resources have been added to those sites. Also added to orientation sessions pre-placement, which might go a little bit to one of the questions in the chat around that, understanding the nature of work and how GenAI fits with that, because I guess that was one of the things that we discovered as we talked more and more as a group, was that it's so contextually specific, this stuff, that you really can't come up with too much that's generic for all places beyond those prompting questions. So yeah, I guess that was all I wanted to add, Jennifer, that lots of enthusiasm for this. And I'm not sure in hindsight that I quite grasped how big the gap was, or how much of a need there was for us to specifically address the WIL and GenAI at the WIL placement site. So yeah.
Wonderful, thank you, Kelly. So this goes a little bit to the process of developing the resources. Can you talk a little bit, can anybody on the panel talk a little bit about the most rewarding parts of working on this project?
I'll jump in there, unless anyone else wants to have a go. I think, the first thing that definitely bears mentioning is getting to work with this wonderful group of people very consistently. As Joe said, we met a lot, and that in itself was particularly rewarding. I think also because we did take the time to really wrestle with how we were going to approach this challenge of putting these guidelines together, and it is its own reward, I think, to take the time to figure out what the right kind of line into it really is. We did try a few different things, and a good example of a development that came out of that, I think, was starting to think in terms of questions. There are different ways you could get into this. We could come really from an AI kind of direction. What are the different things that AI does? Should we have different categories or different approaches for that? I think that what we landed on, thinking through the life cycle of the WIL life cycle, rather, before, during, and after, and really coupling that with practical questions, was quite a useful sort of journey to go on. And along the way, really trying to grapple with this issue of sort of how close to practice we could really be in terms of the guidance we would give, and at what point you're sort of drifting so far into the generic that it actually becomes impractical. And I think it's that problem-solving process that is the reward of this type of work, actually, for me. And I think something that will also bear thinking through as time goes by, give us another year, another 2 years, it will be really interesting to look back and see how these things might need further adapting.
Excellent, thank you. And maybe that where you landed with that question links nicely to another question around the impact you hope these resources will have on the WIL community. Would anybody like to take that one?
I'll take that one just really briefly. Look, our ultimate aim here is not for the resources to be used sequentially and in full. Our ultimate hope here is for a more transparent discussion and practice for students regarding GenAI in their workspaces. It is our hope that students will walk into those workspaces feeling more confident with their knowledge of the ways in which they can use GenAI or not use GenAI or experiment with GenAI and how that relates to their professional practice development and identity. So we really want to be able to ensure that students have the skills to use the tools that are available inside the workplaces that are currently being used inside those workplaces and spaces. And where it's not used, perhaps bring with them some judgment around ways in which it could be used or understandings why it's not. And if the resources are that, open door to enable a conversation, then I feel like that's the impact that we're really striving for.
Excellent. Thank you, Bonnie. And finally, before we launch into questions from the audience, how do you envision the future of GenAI for WIL? Just a little narrow question for you.
I can probably start with, I'll go first. Look, I think what I'd like to see, and it sort of leads on from what Bonnie was just talking about, was that it's something that's just a part of every orientation to any WIL experience, so that it is, and it might it might not be, well, probably would never be every question in any of the documents that we've produced, but it's more about it being front and center of mind. And there's an interesting thread in the chat here about Otter AI, and it's still such a learning space for us. There's still so much we don't know, and I'm no expert on privacy data, but where the GenAI data is kept and the privacy laws in Australia, and I know we've got people from around the world here today, but even knowing, well, if I use this GenAI tool, where's anything I put into it stored, and is that a breach of Australia's privacy law? And things like that are really, really complex questions. And I think at the moment are questions that often people aren't even considering. And even if you do consider them, finding out the answer is really tricky, as to what is and isn't okay. And it's a moving feast, as Jack mentioned earlier. I know we've given our staff at Deakin, or in my school, advice about GenAI use 12 months ago. That's now changed. And so that really confuses people, let alone the students who, might get different responses from different workplaces that they're undertaking WIL in. So I think if we get to the point where it's something that's considered every time, then that would be a wonderful outcome.
Excellent. Thank you, Kelly. And Joe, I think you might have had something to say.
I guess the other perspective to think about is, just what is the future of GenAI in work? And I guess we're all really concerned here about how we're going to support our students to do things where they are that work integrated learning setting, and what does it mean for students? What does it mean for educators? But if we zoom out a little bit, we also have to think about, well, how are people going to be using GenAI across all forms of work? And as Jack said earlier, it's uncertain, it's possibly ambiguous. And this is something that we're going to have to help everyone sort of grapple with as students become people who are, fully in the workplace. And so while, this is a starting point for people to have discussions, hopefully this continues to be part of what they bring with them, that sort of questioning attitude, a little bit more criticality to what's going on, to support whatever happens in the future. So yeah, that future is uncertain, but it's uncertain entirely for everyone, not just not just us within our little part of the world. So we've got to take that with us and support our students to take it with them too, that uncertainty.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for your answers to our pre-planned questions. And now we'll go to some questions from the group in the chat. And I'd like to start with 2 questions. One is there's a question from PB Venkataraman in India, who's joining us from India. They are just starting their structured initiative of AI adoption across their university, and they're looking for advice. And I thought it might be nice to combine that question with a question from Rachel Barron, which is not a question, it's a comment, that her university has recently introduced an AI tool that keeps data input internal, but she's still very cautious about using it. And so I'm just wondering, and there will be some training, so she's got some places to go from there, but I thought taking those 2 questions, on the one hand, from a university-wide planning perspective, what are your thoughts? And then in terms of supporting people to adopt it, what are your thoughts? Anyone?
I'm happy to have a go at those 2.
Yeah, picking the challenging questions, hey? But Kelly, you've got the institutional perspective.
Yeah, well, I guess from the approach we've taken is really a program-wide approach or a course-wide approach to looking at what we're doing, and I think that's one of the things that is helping, because individual academics in this space can feel very unsure or feel like the pressure's all on them to, and I'm talking specifically about assessment here, which is one of my key areas. So I think that sort of broader view, I'm a big believer that the advent of GenAI is allowing us to spend time, potentially addressing some of the limitations of assessment that have always been there in higher ed, and many of us could have identified. So I think that would be one of my bits of advice in regard to the first question, is think bigger picture. And that's really easy to say and really hard to do, to get all the key people in the room to, at Deakin, we're very based on the individual unit, but we're trying to look beyond that, or the individual subject, trying to look beyond that program wide. And I think the other thing that I've found is it's really important to say to people, this can be hard. It's a hard place to be in. We've talked a lot about uncertainty today, and it's okay if you find it hard and you're not alone in that, because sometimes that can be enough. In regard to using the tools that are available internally, I think we have to, and I think we have to embrace GenAI. It's part of all of our, sometimes we don't even know when we're using it now, but it's part of all our lives. So we encourage our staff. We've got Microsoft Copilot available at Deakin, and that's at the moment what I currently encourage our staff to try. Many staff want to put their assessments and things into ChatGPT, which is what probably more of our students are using than anything else. And that's a bit more challenging, because we don't know where that data goes, or we know that it'll be used to change future iterations. Sorry, Joe, I talked a lot then. You might.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Kelly. So the next question that we have is from Amanda Wolf, and she asks or comments that learners also need to know something about work in general and their placement setting in particular, with some baseline knowledge and understanding to help with effective AI use. So do we have good ideas to scaffold work awareness in a specifically AI context? Any comments on that?
I mean, I might just chime in to say that really ambitious and tricky thing to do, because that idea of the specifically AI context is kind of all context. And so I think it's such an interesting question. There is this interesting tension, I think, between I've said half an hour ago that AI is ubiquitous. It's the thing that is kind of, a bit of our byline at the moment. There's also really, I think, a place for leaving the AI to one side, just temporarily as part of what we do. It's the sparkly thing of the moment, and we have to take it very seriously. It is also really important that we have opportunities to cultivate the expertise or the contextual awareness that we then bring into our interactions with AI tools. I definitely can't speak to how we would do that in any individual specific context, and it's something I think we've been probably a little bit careful to avoid doing in our guidance materials. But I do, I think, really appreciate, as part of that comment, the nudge to carve out a pedagogic space to learn how those two things connect together. That's really an endorsement more than a carefully crafted response, I think. But I think seeing these things as, in terms of emphasis, sometimes we want to go one way more than the other to help scaffold how the interaction might take place. The thing we want to be really careful of, I think, is when we put all of our ingredients in the pot too soon together. We want to gradually build the stew of learning, I suppose.
And one of the conversations we had as a team, and launching from Jack's notion, is to examine the world of work, not only focusing on AI, but when you come to have the discussions around AI, we have purposely placed reflective questions right at the top around understanding your own perspectives, priorities, and practices for students and also for industry partners. This includes educators too, because the way that we do things can shape our perception of the world. So if we use GenAI all the time, it might be our perception that everybody could use GenAI all the time. Or if we are really cautious around using GenAI, we might also believe that everybody else is being equally cautious. So what we need to do is come to an understanding of what it is that we believe and know and prefer to use it in certain ways, and articulate those in order to then examine this new context.
Excellent, thank you. I guess I just want to comment before we go on to the next question. One of the, so I really appreciate the resources, and as I mentioned, I had a little bit of a go with them. And I guess part of what this conversation is making me think about, and it is kind of both Kelly's and Jack's recent responses, is how much conversation went on behind the scenes that is not directly reflected in the resources that actually would be really helpful for institutions and individuals. And I think there were some comments here in the chat, and maybe some comments that you couldn't be directive with your guidance, or you had to be careful about people need to adapt this for their context, etc. And at the same time, those conversations are really useful. So I wonder if that's something to think about as a next iteration. How do we benefit even more from all of the work that you have done?
I think also, Jen, that everybody has perspectives. It just, whatever that perspective might be, is that we all come to this with a perspective or with some sort of experience, either lots of experience or limited experience, but either way you have a choice in how you've been using it. And what we want to replicate in your own spaces are these conversations. We've realized through this experience, thank you so much for your beautiful reflection, Jen, because it was within the conversation that the richness and the understanding grew. And we want you to do that with your students, and we want you to do that with your industry partners and also with each other's in your team. To not come at it to say, this is the one way that we're going to do it and everybody should follow my way because this is the way it's going to work, but instead to unpack that together and look at the boundaries and the parameters and the requirements that you need to work within, so that you can have the conversations and you can say, it's okay for this to be messy and it's okay for this to be uncertain. I'm still making sense of it too. But we want to empower you to have those conversations in your spaces.
And if I can chime in, I think, it's a shame Dave couldn't be here, because this is reminding me of one of the comments that he just recently made to us in the email, where he was saying, sorry, I'm going to be on a plane, which is, one of the perspectives he was putting forward just very recently was this idea of humility in this type of work. And I think that it's that spirit of inquiry, not just the inquiry itself. It's not just the how-to and the mechanical sort of problem solving, it's also the attitude to the project. And I think in particularly in this with this topic, I really liked what Dave was kind of putting forward there around this idea of humility as a way of approaching it.
Excellent, thank you. Sarah Jane Gregory has commented, "Such fabulous work, everyone," and asked the question, so where to next? And I think, Bonnie, you might have answered that from our perspective in terms of having conversations in our context. But I also wonder if maybe part of that question is around where to next for the project. And I'm wondering if you can share either further thoughts on the former or the latter.
We're delighted to see a Needed Now article come out today from Sally Kift and Jason Lodge. They've been so encouraging of this work and provided some great feedback on the article in the early stages. So wider dissemination of the resources has been a priority. We're also working on a paper in the background around the notion of transparency for GenAI and WIL in the background. So we've got a draft of that. We're just finalizing it, and as you know, in the development of papers is how long is a piece of string. And then in terms of the steps after that, we haven't had a further discussion. We kind of really wanted to focus on the resources and give that all of our efforts, and then make sure that the paper comes next. But if I could just reflect back to the community who's online with us today and who is watching this recording, there's two things I'd really love for you to consider. The first one is to consider the ways in which you can use the reflective questions to prompt your practices and prompt your conversations. And the second thing is to really consider the way in which you disseminate any form of experimentation or steps that you take. In the WIL Australia ASIN conference last year in October, there were a range of presentations and workshops focusing on AI in WIL, really just to get us started. And in the WIL NZ conference 2 weeks ago, there was also a couple coming out through there. What I'd really love to see is more practice studies, case studies, examples, and I think through the dissemination, we can actually learn as a community. So if you're looking for an immediate forum, go pop your examples on LinkedIn so we can share it and learn from each other. That's a really great social platform. And beyond that, also consider other ways in which you might disseminate with your local communities of practice and also more widely across WIL Australia and other platforms.
So just a note here that Michael McCabe has commented, "Thank you to the speakers, appreciate the wisdom and learning being shared," and is asking any prospect of developing a WIL-specific AI use case library with guidance on application and WIL context across different fields of practice with reference to ethical and professional considerations. And I think, Bonnie, that is sort of what you were just proposing, a number of ways to do that. And I'll just mention that Sarah Jane Gregory has commented that she and her team are hoping to do just that. And so I think there's a role for us to play as a community in those next steps. And I'm now looking to see, we have just maybe another minute or two or time for another question or two. And it looks like there's a lot of conversation in the chat. But I'm not seeing questions. An acknowledgement from Rachel Barron that we're actually used to a little bit of messiness and ambiguity as WIL practitioners, that this is maybe not comfortable space, but certainly familiar space. And so I think with that, if somebody sees a question that was posted that I have missed, it looks like mostly comments. Yes.
Yes, I had, I've just seen Alan Longmuir pop something in about, knowledge worker space and in terms of evolutions in technology and whose jobs are going to disappear. And I guess one of the things that, going back to Jen, what were the hidden conversations, I think was really about what types of things we need to develop in our students, what types of skills, capabilities, ways of being, knowing, doing that are really important to develop as we consider, okay, so GenAI might be able to do these things, but what can humans do, and what should remain the domain of humans, what should humans still be in charge of? Because I think you can see there are many examples of how you can get GenAI to do a lot of things for you, but do they do a good job? How do we know it's a good job? And so sort of, again, reflecting back to perhaps within a particular discipline, a context, what are those things that it's still really important for humans to be in charge of? Was one of those ideas we had in the background. And I think we're probably still grappling with a little bit about how that might be sort of easily communicated, because it is, again, like many things, potentially context related as to how that might play out in an actual context. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you to everybody who has posted questions. And on that note of the value of humans, I'd like to ask everybody to join me in a big round of applause for our presenters here today. We're so absolutely thrilled to that this joint event with WIL Australia and CRADLE has been the launch point, or the big launch event for these resources. It's wonderful. And we're thrilled to have hosted it and to hear a little bit about the story behind the story. And I will just echo so many comments in the chat to thank the 4, but actually 5, yes, 5 of you who brought us to this point today. And Bonnie, have we taken enough LinkedIn photos, or shall we get everybody to smile one more time?
Let's all do that. So if you are willing to take a LinkedIn photo, if we have your permission to do so, please turn your camera on and smile directly at that little spot just there on your computers or your laptops. And then Vanessa and Jen, if you're keen to take some photos as well, and I'll take one too. Alrighty, let's do a countdown. Ready? 3, 2, 1. Yeah, lovely. I've got mine. Thank you, Jen.
Excellent. And with that, I will say a big thank you, and we shall see you at the next event. Everybody take care.